I have a background in conservation before I moved into climate, and so it's an absolute delight to be able to host this particular session. So I'm just going to start with a quick introduction to what we're going to hear about today and to our contributors. If I can just go around and ask you to introduce yourselves. We've got Alan McDonnal, who works for Trees for Life. So can we hear from you? Give us a quick intro.
Yeah, hi Kat. Yeah, I'm Alan. I've got a long background in conservation. Worked for SNH for many years. Out in Isla, covering Isla Dura Colonsay, and then around Stirlingshire in the Trossachs, nature reserve management, and over in Argyll. But I've been with Trees for Life for 5 years now, so I've moved from kind of formal conservation into the rewilding world, and I'm enjoying that immensely.
Thank you. We've got Sarobidy Rakotonarivo, who is coming to us from Madagascar, and she works for ESSA Forêts. So let's pass over to Sarobidy. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Kat, and hi everyone. So I'm Sarobidy. I've recently returned to Madagascar after studying and doing research in Europe, mostly the UK, for about 10 years. So my background is in environmental economics. I'm a social scientist. I'm mostly interested in the trade-offs between conservation and people's livelihoods. And currently I'm working on a research project called Forests for Climate and People, which looks at the social aspects of forest conservation projects as well as forest restoration. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have Veronique Walraven from Morven Community Woods. Could you give us a little intro?
Yes, yeah. So I'm originally from the Netherlands, but I moved to Scotland 13 years ago, and for the last 11 years I've been involved with the Morven Community Woodlands. I'm one of the trustees, voluntary trustees. I don't have a background in biology or ecology or conservation. My background is actually in theatre, so I come from a very different point of view. And that's my short bio.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure that a lot of people joined this fascinated by your photograph on the on the website, where you're wearing a lichen beard as from one of your productions.
Yes, yes. I was considering making another one, especially for you, but no.
Thank you. So just as a quick introduction, there's a lot of talk around trees, the conservation of forests, and restoring forest and woodland as part of a real key action in dealing with climate change. But you know, sometimes you see these figures of people saying we're going to plant 10,000 trees a year, that's Scotland, or we're going to plant 50,000 trees a year, which is what we've just heard from the UK government, or even more. And actually it isn't as simple as that. It's not as simple as just planting lots of trees. We know that in Scotland because, you know, if you plant on deep peat, there's been research that shows that so much more emissions are created from planting that tree than it will absorb from the damage to the peat bog. And also obviously the implications for biodiversity. It depends on what tree you're planting and where, as to how good what it is that you're creating is for other collateral benefits, like for biodiversity or for increasing quality of life and things like that. So, you know, we kind of know that what you plant and where you plant is really important. But this talk is actually more about how you plant it. So it's not just about what you're planting, where you're planting it, it's how do you go about planting it. When you're thinking about who are you including in your plans for it, who is it who benefits from it, where's the funding coming from and who's gaining, what's the economic impacts and things like this, and who are you involving. And I think all of that is incredibly important, not just for those other benefits that can come out of conservation of forests or restoration of forests. It's for actually creating a truly sustainable forest and a truly sustainable climate impact as well. So I'm going to start by handing over to, who's going to be first on my list? I think it's to Alan. So Alan's already given us his intro, and he has said to me when we were talking about this in advance that Trees for Life is guided by a conviction that nature, communities and business interests can not only coexist, but can complement each other to thrive through the changes the future's bringing. So I've asked Alan to give us a bit of a presentation, tell us a bit more about that approach that brings those three interests together, and also the value that it brings for climate change and for communities. So I will hand over to Alan.
Okay, thanks very much, Kat, and hi everybody. It's nice to be here, especially I've just accidentally crashed out of the Zoom meeting, but managed to get back in time. I'm just going to share a few slides here to take you through today. Now, I'll just get this right. So first of all, I want to talk about the connection between rewilding. Trees for Life, a charity about rewilding. We work in the Scottish Highlands, a long history in involving volunteers to take practical action to let natural processes operate. So I want to talk about the connection between nature and restoring nature and climate change, and which brought me to my favorite acronym that I learned last year in 2019. My acronym of 2019 is LULUCF, which stands for land use change and forestry, which is why there's a scary picture of Lulu and a tree here. It's as complex as my reasoning got. But really what that's speaking to is the recognition, including by the Committee on Climate Change, which supports the UK government on how to mitigate climate change, that there's a strong relationship between, and that land use can have a real bearing on our climate. And particularly in Scotland, where they've identified that Scotland has the opportunity to go net zero 5 years before the rest of the UK because of the potential in its land use. And that refers to two things in particular. One is the ability for the potential for afforestation and for carbon to be sequestered in trees that grow in the timber. And this is Glen Affric, and one of Trees for Life's first projects, and one of the ones we're most proud of, where volunteers planted trees, and they've given rise to 2, even 3 generations of trees since. And the idea that a natural forest returning is quite strong there. But peatlands is also a massive part of the land use and climate picture in Scotland. So much of Scotland is covered by organic soils, and far too much of it looks like the picture on the left there, where once intact peatlands have, primarily through overgrazing and trampling effects from sheep and deer, going back decades and centuries, has opened up the top of the soil, exposed the peat underneath to the air, and the oxidation of the peat has taken place, and loads of CO2 has been lost in that process and continues to be eroded from these landscapes. Slide on the right shows an area very much just like that, that kind of eroded peat hag there that's been restored. The drainage has been blocked, and that soil can restore itself. And whilst it might take many years, it'll take millennia before you build all the lost peat back up again, you can at least stop the bleeding. So from our peatlands are a place where we can stop the emissions that are going on. We're literally losing carbon through our landscape. So all that points to the fact that in much of Scotland we need to change the land use, but of course land use is made by humans, and so to change land use we need to influence those humans and recognise what they need and where they're coming from. And there are cultural dimensions to this as well as economic ones. People manage land for economic reasons. So we need to be able to speak to their values, and need to be able to speak across the cultural divides that affect and in too many cases polarize our relationships, especially around land use and the deep-seated emotions that go with that. So we need to find a way of starting those conversations, and stuff that Trees for Life is trying to do is starting to try to speak to that. And we think that within that, communities play a really important role, a vital role in being connected to that, connected to the land, and having a stake in that future. So go past the forest again, past the nasty peatland. And in some ways, this does boil down to how you want to look at the future. If we're talking about a need for change, then we can all look at that and see dangers in that, or we can look for opportunities. We think the former course sort of saying, well, do we want to be scared of change as one that's not going to be progressive? So we've looked at, well, how can we put this in a way that can involve more stakeholders and and find a partnership, a collaborative way forward that can actually work for everyone. And as we did that, three things really clicked into place for us that are really guiding what we've done since then. The first one is this, that we have more in common than we might think. And this is about recognizing that everybody cares about the land, its well-being, and the communities that live in that, no matter what side of the equation you're coming from. And so this idea of there being a sort of a three-legged stool between nature, people, and the economy. For us, all of those things need each other to survive, and they'll thrive best if they're working together. And that led on to this question here, which we think is key. How can we use these shared interests to create a future that we all value, and even to think about the legacy that we'll leave, behind us? And so we started to focus explicitly on how to form a partnership around that, and how to bring those three different interests into the same room, and to find a positive way forward. So we started a conversation, which continues to be interesting actually, but bringing people together into a room, landowners of traditional sporting type estates and community groups, and a whole range of different types of people and outlooks, and saying actually we think there's a potential partnership here, and that conservationists can be part of that and have a part to play in that, and in owning these three agendas. And that was greeted with a kind of cautious curiosity, I would say, which we found quite encouraging considering we were at the start. But we were asked, well, so what does this really look like in practice? And it's relatively easy to talk about what that looks like in ecological terms, but not so much in economic and social terms. And so since that time, which was just over a year ago, we had that first conversation. We've been working on, well, what's the potential for what we call nature-based businesses in a landscape? And I should explain here, we're looking specifically at a large highland landscape, taking in 4 glens, roughly centered on Glen Affric. It's around about 660 square miles. It's a big chunk of Scotland, but not absolutely gargantuan. Whole range of different interests there. So we have, as I say, we were looking for what's the economic future here, and how does that tie to livelihoods, and how is that sustainable, and how does that relate to these kind of overriding imperatives such as around climate change. So we looked at carbon offsetting and the opportunities and challenges that go with that, and the ability to sell accredited carbon units, and the potential to do that as a collaborative enterprise. Forestry, different kinds of forestry, and how you can use forestry to be much more locally based, more diverse, often nature-friendly forms using productive hardwoods, and to process the products from that forestry locally, and to add that value locally. Regenerative grazing and the wild food that can go with that. Again, this idea of locally marketing that, and selling that with the story of the land behind it, and the story of how it's all reinforcing nature. Nature-based tourism is a hugely growing area, even under COVID. And then this idea of tying it all together in business ecosystems, so the places active in this landscape and the businesses active in this landscape are servicing each other, and therefore you've a local supply chain, again coming back to the principles of circular economy. So we've done a study on that and shown people kind of what that is, and we're talking to people about that, and people are starting to come to that, and we're seeing people sign up for what we hope will be a big project focused on this landscape. And that's something we hope to start really developing in earnest next year. Norway is often looked at as a place where we can draw lessons from. And I think these numbers are really interesting, just speak to what's possible in the Highlands. You compare those population densities across that 660 square miles I mentioned, there's something like 3,000 people. It's a tiny population covering, considering the size of that area, and just see how compared to Southwest Norway, I'm sure many people are familiar with the work of Duncan Halley. I've directly taken this from Duncan's work. So it just shows what the potential of, in a very similar landscapes at a similar latitude with similar biophysical conditions, there are economies there that can sustain more people. And you see the income comparisons as well directly from the land. So we're really going forward with the conviction that by working together, there are ways that, and putting nature at the front of what we do and how we think that we can address those land use changes that will help with climate change, can bring livelihoods and sustainable livelihoods into these landscapes, and that the benefits of that and those livelihoods will be available in those communities. And in doing that, because it's all based on nature and the land, that connects all those three aspects of what we're doing. And that's what we're about. The project is called East West Wild. It's just gone official, it's just gone above the waves. We launched it week before last. And our hope is that we will get development funding next year, and it will be underway proper in 2023. And that's all from me, Kat.
Thank you. That's really exciting that this new project, this huge project, is just starting out, and we'll have to invite you back in 2023 and see how it's going. So the great thing about this webinar is we've got 3 people from completely different perspectives. So Alan coming in as a conservation practitioner working for a small NGO, and then we have a researcher, Sarobidy, coming in from the point of view of having done research in both Scotland and in Madagascar and mainland Africa as well. And also we've got Veronique, who's coming very much from the community perspective. So I want to draw Veronique in next. So please tell us a bit more about the work you've been doing. You've been 11 years involved in your local community woodland, and I feel that you'll have a really good insight into what it is that makes a successful community involvement in woodlands and woodland restoration. So over to Veronique.
Thank you very much. Right, well, I'm not so sure about the successful, but I will definitely say a couple of things of what I've learned in the last 11 years when it comes to community engagement. So I've got a little, not quite as professionally looking, but I've got some slides as well. So, I'm a trustee, a voluntary trustee from the Morven Community Woodlands, and I would like to kind of emphasize this because we don't have any paid members of staff, so everything we do is all entirely done by volunteers. So now Morven, even though it's a big peninsula, it's about twice the size of, almost twice the size of the Isle of Wight. So, and it's kind of, but nobody's heard of it, you know, it's largely unknown. And there's about 350 people living here. So it's really, you know, there's not many people. So it's remote and it's thinly populated. So now, why it is really kind of special when it comes from a woodland point of view is that we've got, and I'm going to deny, so this is kind of Morven, we've got about 7,000 hectares of commercial forestry in Morven. You know, some of it is Forestry Commission, although that's, I think it's called Forestry Enterprise nowadays, and some of that is privately owned. But we also have got some of the most special native woodlands. And as I said, I'm not an ecologist or anything, so I really can't, I'm not really kind of know too much about it, but I do know that some of them are under, you know, they're not in great condition because of overgrazing, and kind of especially kind of regeneration is suffering from that. So now, like I said, I don't, so my background is in theatre, and within Morven Community Woodlands, what I've always tried to do is connect people with the natural environment in creative ways. So, and I think that's why I've been asked to join this discussion. So my approach very much is colored by what I did before I came to live in Scotland. So I did a master's degree in theatre studies, and I went to work for an outdoor theatre festival in the north of the Netherlands. which is called Oerol, and all of those kind of theatre productions are taking place in kind of natural environments, on the beach or in an old shed or in the woods. And this is where I kind of came to realize that nature and art can really enhance each other and make people appreciate the nature more. And so when I came to live in Morven, this is what I wanted to kind of like, I wanted to create theatre in the woods. But over time, I came to realize that there was much more about generally connecting people with woodlands. Because if you get people into woodlands, create this connection between people and woodlands, they will start to care about them. And so in those 11 years, I've kind of learned 3 things. First of them is get them young, you know? So a couple of years ago, I was at a conference of either Community Woodlands Association or the Community Land Scotland, I can't remember, but one of them. When there was a discussion about the difficulties some committees have in getting young people to come on their committee. My experience is that that you are too late if you try to get a 20-something-year-old interested. You need to get them involved when they are, I don't know, 3 or something like that, you know, or even younger. And really the most easy way to do that is actually kind of just organize an Easter egg event. It's really, it's a no-brainer. This is very much from kind of a grassroots, perspective. But and so, for example, this is a picture from 10 years ago, and I think Kat, you might kind of recognize one of them. Kind of the little girl at the front there is a girl who is now 14, and she is one of our young representatives of Morven Community Woodlands. So if you get them when they're like 4, then you might have a good chance of getting them involved in your community group later. Now, so this year, for example, we couldn't do an Easter egg hunt because of the pandemic. So what I did do is I created fairy houses in the woods, and to make sure that those young people, those really young people, still kind of made, you know, that they wanted to come into the woods, that they were kind of keen to come into the woods. So now the next thing that I've learned is that you have to be creative in getting people to the woods. So so you can get people into your woods if you organize something which is unusual. So for our first big event, we got the theatre group Tipuca, and they did kind of loads of workshops with the school, collecting local stories and traditions. And after just about 10 days of that, of frantic community activity, the result was a theatrical event in Agnaha, which we own, which is about 8 hectares. And more than 100 people came to this event. So that's almost 1/3 of our population. And one of the things that I remember very clearly is to make things a bit unusual. One of the local traditions is that in Morven, we've got basically one road which goes from Lochalan to Drimnin, and halfway is a kind of a very special rock, which is called the wishing stone. And in the olden days, when there was a funeral procession, they would stop there and they would have a whiskey there as well. So in our promenade performance that we did, we had a whiskey stop as well. So if you want to get people involved, get people into the woods, maybe offer them a dram, that would kind of work. So now we knew that we couldn't keep on hiring people. So in 2010, we organized a workshop in outdoor theatre. How can you use your natural environment for art? And so that was really useful. And this resulted in a promenade theatre production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. So you've got Oberon here on the right-hand side, which is actually kind of like the head teacher of our local primary school. So we got the audience had to walk through the woods to be able to get the whole story, and the actors would be running sometimes kind of through the audience. And all the actors were locals. They were primary school kids, high school children, the local GP, a couple of teachers, as mentioned, some of them pensioners. And if you look at the main picture there, it's interesting that kind of Douglas, he is now a woodworker, and Clara, she works in nature conservation in Asia now. So, and they were in high school at that time. Then the year after, we did As You Like It in 2012. And again, kind of similar idea. And if you kind of, this girl here, kind of the girl in the middle, that's Vela. And I think she was either just in high school or maybe she was still in primary school. But she is now studying land management, and she is actually one of our trustees. So you need to think about different ways that you can do with the woods, something that tickles people's imagination. And we are very lucky that our woods include a bit of shoreline. So last winter solstice, we organized a sunset swim, and that was really a big hit, you know. So people really connected, kind of immersed themselves into nature, more or less, by kind of going into the swim while the sun was setting on the shortest day of the year. So yeah, so I think that's what MCW is really quite good at. We you know, the other thing is that you want people to come to your AGM, and quite often people find AGMs really quite boring, and they're not really that interested in AGMs. So, but what we try to do is quite often we add something to our AGM. So we would have a tree identification walk, or we would have a talk, or something anyway. And then a couple of years ago, and this is where the lichen beard comes in, we did a short play, which was written by two of our trustees, and it was based on our longest standing trustee who was stepping down, Donald Kennedy, and the play was called a minor tree report. So it's kind of a play on word, a minority report. So and he's got a big beard, so I made a beard from lichen. And kind of the third thing that I've learned in those 11 years, oh, I don't think I've got any more pictures, but the third thing that I've learned in those 11 years is that if you want people to connect, you need to feed them. So, and this sounds really trivial, but so there's something about eating and drinking together, which makes communication so much easier. So if you want to do a talk in a village hall, or, you know, coffee, tea, and especially cake is a must. So now, yeah, so like I say, you know, it makes kind of conversations flow easier just if you're kind of having a cup of tea as well as something to eat. So for example, if you do an Easter egg hunt, you know, make sure there's kind of like a barbecue as well or something like that. Now, I need to add that, you know, it doesn't always work. You know, it doesn't always work to kind of, can't always connect with people. And I think, yeah, so despite all our efforts, sometimes the message just doesn't come across, you know. And we were in a very unusual situation earlier this year. And I'm certain that some of you might have heard about this. You know, so we own 8 hectares, but we wanted to buy a larger piece of land so that we could do some bigger projects. And we were in an unusual situation for 2 reasons. First of all, we applied, so we wanted to buy a piece of land which is about 2,500 hectares. And the Scottish Land Fund was oversubscribed, so we didn't get the full funding, which meant that Morven Community Woodlands needed to find a large amount of money ourselves during a pandemic. And I'm fairly certain, and this is the bit which is unusual, I'm fairly certain that we were the only organization entirely run by volunteers who was ever put in this situation. The other bit that is particularly unusual is that we felt that in order for such a project to be successful, we needed to be sure that the community was behind the project. So even though it was a negotiated sale, we wanted to do a ballot, which was delayed because of the pandemic by months. And but then when the ballot, actually the results came through, it turned out that actually the community didn't want us to buy the large estate. So that was the unusual situation. We actually had a community here who said, no, we don't want Morven Community Woodlands to buy a large estate on behalf of the community. So, and many people have asked me, why did people vote the way they did? And to be honest, I am a little bit baffled about it. But in my opinion, the outcome might have been different if we had been able to hold more community get-togethers. So I'm coming back to one of my earlier points that I think the problem might be the lack of cake. So that's me from now.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Veronique, because I think that is so relevant to what we're trying to talk about today, is that, you know, you can get people who are really excited about it in communities, but actually sometimes it's a real challenge to get buy-in from the larger majority of people. So I think it's a really, really relevant thing to be talking about. So just remember to put any questions that you've got into the chat, and we'll collect them all up. Now I'd like to hand over to Sarobidy. Sarobidy has experience of both working in Scotland and in Madagascar, and this is really pretty great for us because she understands sort of where we're coming from with these presentations, and is now going to add in an international dimension from the point of view of a researcher. So I'll invite Sarobidy to give us a bit of an overview on what she's learned about the best ways of conserving forests, bearing in mind the work that she does with people. So go ahead, Sarobidy.
Yeah, thank you, Kat, and hi everyone. There were some latecomers, so yeah. I'm currently working for a research project called Forests for Climate and People. Today I'm going to try to answer Kat's question, what I have learned about the best way to conserve forests. So I think the very short and concise answer to that question is that for conservation to be successful, for them to succeed, they need to be fair and equitable. It's increasingly recognized that conservation goals cannot be achieved without considering local people's needs and evolving them. For instance, the Convention on Biological Diversity explicitly requires conservation to be fair and equitable. Everyone seems to agree with this, but in practice, we don't know. It has received very little attention, and there are still some misunderstandings about what fair and equitable conservation practically means and how to achieve it. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to elaborate on these two terms, fair and equitable. What do they mean and how to achieve them? So my talk is going to be informed by an editorial that I co-authored with colleagues Neil Hockley and Rina Mandibniena. It's open access, and also a research project called P4GES, which stands for Paying for Global Ecosystem Services, Reduce Poverty. Let's start. We all know that forest conservation, it brings global benefits. Forests, for instance, it can help stabilize the climate. Forests regulate ecosystems. They protect biodiversity, such as you can see, these cute lemurs. And forests play an integral part in the carbon cycle. But it's not only about global benefits. forest conservation can also have local costs. It's not always about win-win. And this is because forest lands provide access to fertile soils to millions of small farmers in the tropics. And when we stop people from converting these forest lands to agriculture, their livelihoods will be negatively affected. And these trade-offs between forest conservation and local livelihoods, they are not different from what's happening elsewhere in the world, like in Europe. I had the privilege and also the honor to talk to farmers in Orkney, Scotland. So that's in the northern part of Scotland. In that region, geese, grey-lag geese, the number of these species has significantly increased over the last few years. And while this increase in goose number was seen as one of the major success stories of European conservation, geese have caused significant agricultural damage to farmers. And this is because these geese, they feed on people's crops and also on grasslands. And they also cause soil compaction and puddling, which reduces crop yield. On Islay, which is an island of the west coast of Scotland, these costs have been estimated at £11,000 per farm, or £13 per goose in 2000, and that's a lot. So coming back to the tropics, for conservation to be fair, local people who are actually among the poorest, they shouldn't bear any negative impacts from conservation. That means that any local cost of conservation must be compensated. And our research suggests that these costs are significant in local terms, that is compared to people's local income. They are felt over decades across many generations, and these local costs were largely undercompensated. So if we look at this graph, you see I don't know if you can see my mouse. So the little this blue bar, this is the total spent on compensation for per household. And you can see here that it's much smaller compared to the total estimates of local costs. So these are the costs that are incurred by local people from conservation restrictions. The good news is that the carbon revenue, the carbon value that the REDD+ project is expected to deliver over the next 10 years are much higher compared to this local costs. And this means that there is potential, there are opportunities to compensate for this local costs by transferring these global benefits to local people. So this issue of incomplete, inadequate, or inconsistent compensation for the local cost of conservation is not unique to Madagascar. We found similar evidence in Orkney, where we worked, where farmers also incur significant losses from geese, and these losses have not been compensated. So if you are interested in this study, we published an article in an open access journal, People and Nature, and there is a plain language summary that's accessible, very accessible to anyone, that summarizes this study. So far, we've looked at what fair conservation means. So that's the fair compensation for the local cost of providing global benefits. But that's not enough. Local community participation also needs to be equitable. And I'm sure you've heard that term, equity. so that also means, in other terms, like full and effective participation of local community. So this equitable participation can be achieved through this free, prior, and informed consent. So this big concept requires that consent of local people must be sought at all stages of the conservation project. For instance, if you go to a village and you want to establish a conservation project, and if people say no, they don't want it, we need to take no for an answer. So most conservation projects, they claim that they have consulted local communities, but in reality, it's not always the case that like people's voices and opinions are being heard. I think that the root cause of this problem, that is this inadequacy of big concept, is because of land tenure complexities in most of Africa. So in Africa, unlike Europe, most natural forests that belong to the state, this is, I must say, a legacy of colonial conservation. But such state ownership is not seen as legitimate locally by local people, and it often clashes with traditional or customary ownership. This is because these forest lands are actually the customary or the traditional lands of local people. They've been occupying these lands for 4 years, and like in many African countries, the government governments lack the resources to enforce protection, and this on the ground results in a situation of open access where everyone, migrants, residents, illegal loggers, miners, they all scramble to secure new lands for forest conversion. So coming back to this issue of equity, consent, free, prior, and informed consent is impossible without freedom of action. Communities are not really free to refuse conservation when they do not have formal rights over forest resources. And this has led us to argue that one solution to this ongoing forest loss and also these land tenure complexities could be to formally recognize local people's claims to the forest. So this means like fully devolving ownership to local communities. It's not only about giving communities the rights to manage the forest, as in like community-based conservation approaches, but like fully giving them the right to own and manage this forest. And then 10-year reforms could be combined with voluntary conservation easements, which would give people more freedom of action and also ensure genuine, like consent. This is an approach that's already been widely used in many Western countries, such as goose payments on Isla. So in Isla, people are getting paid for allowing geese to graze on parts of their farms. Okay, so to wrap up, while devolving forest ownership to local people has several advantages and would also help ensure effective consent and compensation. Currently, it has its own challenges, and the legal framework for like such radical tenure reform is still absent, and I think it will be very complex, and it will still take many years. So in the meantime, it's really important to establish robust, independent oversight of the social impacts of conservation. So donors have a big role to play in this. They should demand and fund this oversight, and they should refuse to fund conservation activities that do not budget realistically for compensation. To conclude, like sustainable management protected areas in countries like Madagascar, with political instability, poor governance, poor infrastructure, depends a lot on, like the goodwill of local communities, and we need the cooperation. They are willing to cooperate. They do value lemurs. They value, like the hydrological benefits of standing forests, or the collection of medicinal plants. But when you put the interest of lemurs or forest conservation before their needs, that's when things become messy. I'm not very optimistic about, like us trying to achieve conservation goals without fully embracing these notions of, like fair and equitable conservation. And that's for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarobidy. So, listening to those three talks, I was really struck by a bit of a theme of kind of land ownership there. You mentioned just now, Sarobidy, about consent is impossible without freedom of action, and that people in Madagascar in these forests aren't free to refuse conservation because they haven't got land rights. And that feels like it kind of, Veronique was talking about they have 6 hectares. They were looking for this community buyout, and Scotland does have one of the most unequal land ownerships in the world, due to kind of feudal systems that we've had in the past. And then of course Alan was talking about the amount, the chunk of land they've got in Scotland is absolutely immense. They've obviously bought it off one landowner, but now they're the landowner, and it's how do they responsibly engage communities and make it something. And I was wondering whether any of you would comment on the sort of land ownership, reflecting what Sarobidy's already said, and I'll ask Veronique and Alan to talk a little bit about your feelings of kind of that. So how does that impact people in Scotland? Can I start with Veronique?
Yes, I suppose you could. I'm not quite sure whether my view is, since this kind of ballot is kind of generally endorsed by the community in Morven, but we have done in Morven, we did a pie of who owns Morven, and so there was a large chunk which was forestry enterprise, and then there was kind of large chunks which were kind of privately owned. Then there was kind of a small chunk which was kind of owned by people who have less than 100 hectares. And then there was a tiny bit which was owned by people who've got their own house and their garden, they're really, really small. And then the last, you couldn't even see it. It was just a black line, and that was kind of community owned. And that was kind of, so that was Achnaha, which is 8 hectares, and then we've got 4 more hectares of Hazelwood, which is owned by the Morven Community Development Company. And what we see in Morven, anyway, is that in the last 20 years, the school roll of the primary school has gone down from 32 to just 12 this year. So we definitely need to bring kind of young families in. And if we don't have a say in how we manage land, because what we have noticed, we've talked with Woodlands Croft, the organization, is that people are particularly looking for a house with a bit of land, and they don't necessarily need to own it, but they would like to kind of make use of it and feel connected to it. And I think this is, for me personally, this is a great way of bringing people in and bringing kind of that chunk, because if you look at Morven, we've got a lot of second homeowners, so, and we've got a lot of pensioners, but actually kind of the group who of the working age population, the ones who might have children and bring those children to the primary school, which in my opinion is the center of our community, is really, really tricky. And the only way to do that is actually kind of having land available for potential businesses and Alan was talking about kind of businesses that could be actually kind of land-based businesses that are actually kind of that are dealing, you can have businesses which are ecologically friendly and actually kind of economically viable as well. So we really have been looking into that, and we would love that, we would love that to happen. And we were really crushed that our vision in that way wasn't shared by the whole community. And yeah, so I can't say anything else about this, to be honest.
Yeah, totally. I have so much sympathy for all the work that the people have put into that bid. So Alan, over to you. I mean, you're in a relatively uncomfortable position here when I ask you about what do you think about this very unequal land ownership we got in Scotland. It's mainly owned by private landowners, and you are now one of those as Tree for Life. Do you think that there is, what do you feel about land ownership, and whether that is one of the impacts that is perhaps preventing more community kind of involvement or like depopulation of the Highlands or whatever?
Yeah, I think it's really complex, but I think it's a huge factor. It's been interesting. It's been interesting in general. Our kind of the journey I described that Trees for Life has been on, and trying to map our way into the relationships around the landscape, the human landscape, if you like, and how different stakeholders in that landscape respond to proposals or possible change. And what I find is talking to communities, and I really feel like I'm at the bottom of a learning curve here, but putting a kind of a sort of a land-based and nature-based economy type proposal to communities, the general reaction I've had so far is kind of at best a bit interested, and in general a sense that if this is about land, it's not for us because we don't own land, and almost a sense of stop bothering us. And that it varies very much, and that's probably an unfair characterization, but I have a bit of I think we've got a real job to do to make this East West Wild project float, for instance, in persuading the communities that the benefits will come to them, and the kind of land-based livelihood that Veronique was just talking about is possible, and possible on a bigger scale than we have at the minute. The land is capable of genuinely sustaining with its nature a bigger economy. And
so, I mean, from what you're saying, it sounds a bit like a culture change is needed, that, after centuries of not owning land, coming after centuries of people working the land and being on the land, it is a culture change that's needed. I wanted to sort of pass on to Sarobidy for you to perhaps expand on anything where that relates to your work in Madagascar, but I'm also sort of wanting a bit of a response to my next question, which is about whether in our experiences, conservation organisations and communities always see eye to eye. Like, do we experience that they see eye to eye, or do we experience conflict? And a little bit of expansion on that. So over to you, Sarobidy.
Thanks, Kat. That's a really good question, and a topic that I've been really interested in for the past 5-7 years. So yeah, when you say it, is it more of a conflict or more, do they share common grounds when it comes to, conservation? In my experiences, I must say that it's more conflict and trade-offs, because, conservation organizations, they're primarily interested in, conserving biodiversity, reaching a certain target for some species, but local people, especially those that are on forest age, forest communities, they've got mouths to feed, and their primary interest is their livelihoods. So yeah, most often, I don't think they often speak the same language. Yeah, so conservation organizations, they consult local people with the aim of for instance, like the idea of establishing protected areas, and then local people often resist this because they often see this as, you know, like infringing, like encroaching on their lands, and you know, like putting restrictions on what they can do.
So
yes.
would you say that what happens is they have different objectives and they don't really meet, so they can't meet in conversation because they have different, what they're trying to achieve is different?
Yeah, in short, that's the case.
And what about, I'd like to pass this on to Alan, as a conservation organisation. What's your experience of communities and conservationists seeing eye to eye? Do you feel they do? Do you feel they don't?
It's patchy. I identify a lot of what Sarobidy described, and I've been part of a conservation organisation that's made those kind of missteps. There's a tendency, and certainly in my own career and the way I've come through into conservation, is that we as conservationists see ourselves as the good guys, and we've got you know, we're against environmental damage and damage to the natural environment, and we're going to stand heroically against that.
20 hours.
Sorry.
Oh, and so I think that, and therefore we're a bit deaf and a bit insensitive to the idea that sometimes what we're proposing is change, and then that change can make people uncomfortable. And that does mean that we can talk past communities and end up in conflict without quite understanding how and why. Equally though, I've seen conservation organisations act in a genuinely ground up kind of way, and involve communities from the outset of what they're planning to do, and have conversations which are genuinely open-ended. You know, it's not just a consultation that goes to the sake of going through an exercise to make some relationships. They're about, what do you think? And we will be able to demonstrate to you how we've listened at the end. And if that doesn't go as far as that organisation had hoped, then that's as far as it goes, and you move forward from there with the consensus that you have. And to think in the long term, that's a sustainable way forward.
Thanks, Alan. I've actually got a little extension question to add to that from Esme here, to pass it to Veronique. So Esme's asked about, does it feel for two communities, do sometimes communities see conservationist organisations as intruders, sort of coming in for a project, zooming in, doing some stuff and leaving, or what does it feel like to a community? I know that Veronique in Morven gets a lot of interest from conservation organisations. My own organisation that I used to work for, RSPB, had done some work in Morven. Other organisations are there. It's because it's such an incredible biodiverse place with some amazing woodlands. But what does it feel like from your point of view, Veronique, as a member of the community, with all these conservationists fighting over you?
Well, I think you're probably asking the wrong person, because I'm in favor, you know, clearly. But I do know that some people do. For example, we've got some amazing hazelwoods, and actually, one of the things is actually we've got now some really beautiful hazelwoods in Lochalen as well. So that's actually fairly recent. It's in the last 20 years or so. And there are people who complain about those hazelwoods because they block the view from the Sound of Mull. So even though, you know, they just they look at pictures from the old days, and sometimes you hear people saying, "Oh, look how beautiful it was because all those scrubby trees were not there and they are now there." So sometimes people they're not really always in favor, but I can't really say that I have heard anything against any of the kind of big conservation organizations kind of coming in. But then again, I was really baffled by the outcome of the ballot, so I'm not quite sure whether I've got really the finger on the pulse there. So when it comes to the community, so
okay, and over to Sarobidy, I'm wondering about you. What's your experience? You've spoken to a lot of communities. That's been your job for many years, and your research. what are you hearing from them about conservation organisations? How do they relate to them?
Previously I was a bit, negative, describing this conflict between, conservation organizations' perspectives and local people's views. But we must also admit that, communities, they are heterogeneous. And as Veronique said, they don't always share the same opinions. Some people are actually in favor of conservation, and they do value, the help of conservation organizations in, enforcing protection. It's not always that bad. But what I was what I was presenting is actually the net cost. So these are when we averaged the costs and the benefits, when you sum them across the entire community. But of course, the community is heterogeneous, and there are people who do value conservation and their intervention, but I would say, unfortunately, the majority, there are resistance. And I think this is also caused by, the way we approach communities. It shouldn't only about, consulting them at the beginning when we start, we set up the conservation project, as I said, through free, prior and informed consent needs to be sought through all stages of the project, at the beginning, during the design, the implementation, and there should also be constant monitoring. And the language we use, sometimes we come to these villages with jargons and technical terms. They cannot really relate, and they also often feel intimidated. There is this huge power imbalance between conservation organizations and the local people, because people from conservation organizations, they come to these villages with 4x4 drive, well dressed, and with power and resources, whereas local people, they are mostly these less educated people, less wealthy, and also there is no mechanisms for them to really voice their needs. So in my talk, I forgot to talk also about the role of civil society organizations. I think in Madagascar there are a few, but they are still they are still yet to develop and to really defend local communities' needs and opinions. Don't know if I have answered your question.
That's really interesting. I was actually thinking of your work on Isla as a really good contrast, I suppose, between that, what you were saying about people not necessarily having power and in Madagascar, but the conservation organisations having the power, these educated people coming in with money, with influence, and the power is very much in favour of the. I've just seen a question from Julia Jones. And then the contrast, because I worked for the RSPB and we have reserves in Isla, so we're really aware of this issue. The reverse really, I think, is potentially true in Scotland, where farmers have got a lot of power, they've got a lot of say in their, with their local MSPs, and there's a lot of pressure on conservation organisations and government to compensate, and that helps with that. I'm going to pass over to Julia. Could you unmute yourself and we will try and pin you on the video?
I was literally saying exactly the same point that you've drawn out there. It's the fact that I think in many cases in the UK context, the power imbalance is almost completely the other way around, certainly where the conservation organisation needs to work with the landowners, and if there are relatively few landowners, the power is completely switched around. And I thought that's an interesting question to turn around to the community groups that have worked in Scotland and where they think they fit on this kind of spectrum of power. You know, how much power does or doesn't a small community group in Scotland have with respect to conservation organisations? Do you think, well, I guess we've Veronique's already kind of touched on that. Do conservation groups, so community groups in Scotland, come under the same kind of pressure somehow and sometimes from conservation organisations, or is that power balance just the other way around completely here in the UK?
Can I pass that over to Veronique then? What would you say, your experience? And then I'll go to Alan to get his experience from the other direction.
Wait a minute. So your question was to see how we feel, how much power we have as a community group. Well, I don't really feel that we have much power. So, for example, we needed to, you know, before the community buyout plans, we have dealt a lot with Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and which is the organization in the Highlands to support businesses, but also groups like ourselves who kind of want to buy a piece of land. And I feel that, and I really want to say this as polite as I can, but I think that there has been a little bit of, that we could have had more help. So, for example, we needed a little bit of money for the ballot, because it had to go to a third-party organization because of the pandemic. The Highland Council couldn't organize it, so there was an extra cost. So we asked for some money from Highlands Islands Enterprise, and it was like trying to get blood out of a stone. And we feel that actually. Yes, so I don't really think that we have been truly listened to as a community group. That's my feeling anyway. Yeah.
And what about Alan? Would you be able to kind of reflect on what you feel from the other side? Do you how's your sort of power relations, do you feel, compared with communities?
Yeah, with communities, I think I'm just thinking here in terms of hard and soft power. So where we own land, and we can make unilateral decisions about what happens on that land, and that can influence and have a bearing on people who live around it. And therefore, that's a power imbalance, if you like. There's a dynamic in that equation, and the decisions we make are either responsibly involve the local community or they don't. But there's also, if we're working out with our land, then it's much more about what's the soft power relationship, who's looking to achieve different things, and sometimes that comes down to political influence, or sometimes if it's a project like the one I was describing, then we kind of need the community to buy in. If we can't win that round, then that's going to hold our ambitions. I think with landowners, it's a similar kind of thing. You know, having worked for SNH on Isla at around the time that the goose scheme, one of the times the goose scheme there was being revised, and noticing how SNH had a hard power. It had the law behind it and the protection of the goose species, and the relationships with farmers were really strained because of that, because they felt that conservation had arrived and done this to them regardless of what they thought, and there was a lot of anger on the island at that time. But I've also, you know, in working for an NGO now, I had gone into a conversation with a landowner where he said, "You've got all the power here." And I was like, "What? No, you've got the power because you literally control the land." And he was talking in political terms and seeing how the political debate around the environment and community as well, and the wind's blowing more for more community empowerment and for more environmental protection and enhancement, and that implies a change from what he valued. And so he saw the power dynamic as the other way around. And that was a pivotal conversation for me, because that said that, well, that points to the fact that we both got something to gain out of a relationship here. And a lot of the conversations we have now are less about, well, what's somebody trying to do to me? What's somebody trying to stop me doing? And what are the actual opportunities here? And that is, for me, that has been the key to what can change this situation and change the conversation, change the frame. Because instead of looking at what divides us and what we have been divided about for decades, in the case of the Highlands and with conservation, we can talk about, well, where do we want to go? What do we want to bring with us from the past? What do we want to leave behind? Is there any point in continuing these arguments? And what can we achieve together? And the same applies to communities as it does to landowners, as to conservationists and other stakeholders in the landscape. That's our way home.
Okay, thank you very much. I really would like to open up to some people on the floor. We have 15 minutes left, so if anybody wants to make a point or wants to ask a question, just make it known in the chat. Otherwise, I can continue with these questions, because it's really, really interesting to me. So the next question, really, and this is my kind of last tying up question with a bit of hope at the end of it, I'm really wanting to know what we could change in our approach to all the things that we're doing, that would actually make us better at working together and see more win-wins. So, I mean, I was aware that Sarobidy said, you know, there isn't always win-wins in this. You know, you have to compensate people, and people do lose out. So I would just be really keen to know, what are your observations on the things that you would do to make it better for the future? So shall I go first to Sarobidy, because you were the one that's done so much research on the kind of disbenefits of some of this work for communities?
Yeah, so how can we do things better? Yeah, I think there are so many things we can do better. I already summarized them, also already touched upon them in my talk about, you know, like the need to really understand what fair and equitable conservation mean, and how to achieve that. I talked about the importance of tenure reform. I think that's something that we eventually have to address. I expect lots of you know, like political resistance in you know, like devolving forest ownership to local people, but I think we should at least try. We need to start thinking differently about, you know, like how to solve these issues of you know, like local people not being able to stop outsiders from clearing forests and you know, like entering in their forest lands. And yeah, so ultimately we will eventually have to address that question. And then apart from the tenure reform, I talked about, you know, like this need for independent oversight of the local cost of conservation. That's something that's been missing, that's largely absent in Madagascar's context, because currently there is no mechanisms for, you know, like local people to complain or to voice their needs, or to say, to speak when things go wrong. What's happening currently is that, you know, like this kind of grievances or complaints, they are mediated by conservation organizations who play judge and party, and yeah, this shouldn't be the case. So I really want to insist on the importance of this oversight institution that is to monitor these social impacts, and also ensure that that these social negative impacts are actually compensated. And this is not just a one-off, but, you know, like a long-term monitoring process. So these are my two big takeaways: tenure reform, and also this the importance of this oversight institution and the role of donors in demanding this in their like funding strategies.
There's some really, really positive things. Alan, over to you.
Actually, I had a question for Sarobidy. In terms of the oversight and monitoring social impacts, could you just say a little bit about what that looks like in practice?
So in practice, there is basically nothing. So let's say if someone in the village is unhappy about, like conservation actions or, like conservation rules in their villages, they cannot really speak up. They're not being listened to. First, because I think they lack the capacity to negotiate because of their low education level. And there is no, as I said, there is no mechanism that can actually independently help them voice their needs. Currently, they just have to go to these conservation organizations, which is the closest, I would say, like local authority. And it's wrong because, like, you cannot complain about someone to the same person. That's what I said about playing child and party.
What I'd like to do now is we've actually got a couple of people who are wanting to come in, which is fantastic, and we're relatively near the end. So I'm going to bring in Esme, who wanted to make a comment. Can you unmute yourself, Esme, and we'll see if we can find you to pin you.
Hello, can you hear me, Kat?
Yes.
Hi. Sorry, my internet is not great, then apologies if it cuts off. I think that, as a current student, and I'm finding out more and more, I'm coming from a South American country that have a lot to do with conservation, and is, Colombia and part of the Amazonian is quite seen all the time as a part of things that need to change and as a conflict. One of the things I'm discovering is that we are talking about of all the work that still need to be done, of which is great and is very important, but it would be lovely, and it would be really lovely and very inspiring also to see all the good work that is being done, that we sometimes don't talk that much about it, only because it makes it easier to inspire people and to connect people. And yes, it's a lot still that need to be done, but actually it is a lot the good things that are happening. And if we constantly keep saying to the people, well, it's not that good and it's difficult, that negative reinforcement, can you stop the drive sometimes? And I'm a great believer of conservation, and I hope that I can serve my rights to help as much as I can, but I do like also to see, especially people that is quite inspiring to say, well, we are doing a great job and it's a great things happening, and these are the results and these are the positive things, of which I know that they are there, but they are not always being told.
Thanks,
That's my approach.
Fantastic. I think that's a real challenge to find those stories and put them out there. I'm going to pass over for a question to Mahesh. This is probably our last question, actually. So can you unmute and we'll pin your video?
Hi. Yeah, am I on? Can you
Yes.
hear me? Yeah, okay. Very interesting discussion. I just wanted to ask, I guess, Veronique and Alan, because it's a Scottish context, how important do you think land reform is in Scotland to have any meaningful impact from grassroots organizations, like small community forestry and so on, especially when you think of how unequal it is in terms of land ownership there?
So should we start with Alan? Are you happy to answer that?
Yeah, very. The sort of the potential the entrepreneurship and having a channel somewhere for that entrepreneurship to access the land it needs to start and develop a land-based business relies on access to land, and that's difficult to negotiate in Scotland's very unusual land ownership pattern of today. I noticed on the chat earlier somebody was talking about woodland crofts, and I think that's a really good example. And there are other models around that are looking to work within or just push the current system of ownership we have and give people some influence and some control over land and the ability to develop some income from it. So those sorts of initiatives, I think, are a good example of can point to what's possible if we start to diversify ownership. So, and the government seem to get this. And the Scottish Land Commission is working hard on mechanisms to not just free up ownership, but also how in the short and medium term we get more influence over land into more people's hands and diversify things that way. So that's encouraging and needs to keep developing.
And Veronique, do you have anything to add to that around the point of view?
Yes, I do. I think it is very, very important. However, what I do find, and this is my own personal experience, is that from a grassroots community point of view, and this is kind of, especially from a voluntary body, to go through the hoops to get every point done to try and buy a piece of land is incredibly time consuming and incredibly hard work. For example, the piece of land that we wanted to buy was bought more than 40 years ago, which means that it wasn't on the land register. The borders weren't clear on the land register. We had to find out where the borders are. Now, the community right to buy setup, this is what you have to jump through before you can even try to buy a piece of land as a community group, is asking you to kind of pinpoint this border to a couple of meters. So if you've got, and it's really very precise. So we had to go several times, and Edinburgh is a 5-hour drive from us. We had to go several times to the land register office there. This is we had a trustee who had studying in Edinburgh, so she managed to do that. But it's to kind of, and we had to pay, I think, £20 every time we got a document out. And quite often those documents actually didn't give any information. It just explained a little bit about the land or which, but it didn't actually show exactly where the borders was. To even get that information, just exactly the land itself, was an incredible effort to get through. And then you had to kind of fill in all the forms. Then you had to get a business plan. Then you had to get, and it's all, I understand why you had to go through all those hoops, but it is, for a grassroots organization, it was a full-time job for some of us. It was an incredible amount of work, and then especially when we didn't get a full grant and we actually had to find the remaining 1.7 million. So we actually had to find really rich people who were willing to kind of give us money based on the fact that they won't own it, and we had to find out what were our red tapes, what part, would we, for example, be willing, if somebody was kind of willing to put some money towards it, would we be willing to kind of call it a piece of land, William's Corner, for example? I mean, there's so much that we needed to go through that I definitely think that it can be made better, There's definitely kind of things that can be improved.
Fantastic. Thank you, Veronique. So we're coming to the end of our time. I really, really want to say thank you so much to the participants, to Sarobidy, to Alan and to Veronique. It was such a good discussion, and to be honest, I feel like we could carry on, and I think there's a lot of merit in bringing together communities and conservationists and researchers, because I think that's something that perhaps doesn't happen enough, and to bring in the researchers as well as to talk between ourselves. And there was a very good point made on the chat by Barbara about, look, surely we just need to be listening to each other more and talking all the way through projects, not just at the beginning and the end, or, you know, so there's so much more we could be saying about this. So thank you so much for speakers. Thank you for the participants. I'd like to alert you to a couple of other things that are happening coming up. SCCS has a webinar on the 30th, which is around climate finance. And that is part of our campaign to get the Scottish Government to put more money to climate finance, and you can see it on the link that Tammy's just that's just posted. We've also got a social, a kind of online social, a winter social, and a Christmas ceilidh. So it would be lovely to see you at the Christmas ceilidh. We managed to do a ceilidh last month and make it really together, and people all felt like they were all together in the same place, even though we were all in our different homes. We've got a fantastic accordionist called Sandy Breakin who will be leading that for us. And just keep in touch on the Climate Fringe website of all the other things that are going on. And this recording will be available for you to share, and we'll email everybody with that. So thank you very much. Have a nice evening, everybody. And could the speakers stay on the line? Because